The new supervisor told the control room there was no such thing as a plane that radar simply refuses to see. 19 seconds later, the cleaning woman with the mop bucket in the corner set it down without a sound and started counting under her breath. Before we go further, if you like stories where the person nobody's paying attention to turns out to be the only one who understands what's actually happening, type the word ghost in the comments right now. Not for luck. Because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why that word matters. And I want to see how many of you catch the reason before I say it out loud. Nobody at Halvern Regional Approach Control had ever asked the cleaner her name. She was Tuesday and Friday nights, 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. A small, wiry woman named Adeyeze Obi, who moved through the tower's ground floor and the radar room upstairs with a cart, a spray bottle, and a set of noise-canceling headphones hanging around her neck that she never actually used for noise. She emptied bins. She wiped down consoles nobody had touched all shift. She refilled the coffee station without being asked, and never once helped herself to a cup. Because in 11 years, she had never quite stopped feeling like a guest in a building she used to run. And twice a night, without fail, she stopped at the oldest piece of equipment in the room, a boxy analog backup radar repeater nobody had switched on in 11 years, sitting dark and dusty in the corner because it had been replaced by 3 newer systems. And she cleaned it slowly, carefully, running her cloth along the same 6 dials every single time, in the same order, for exactly as long as it took her to hum 4 bars of a song under her breath. Nobody had ever noticed the timing. Nobody had ever asked why a piece of decommissioned equipment got more attention from the cleaning staff than the coffee machine. It looked like nothing. It looked like a woman who took pride in thoroughness. That was the first thing that would matter later, and not one person in that building had any reason to suspect it. The second thing sat in her coat pocket every night she worked, a small spiral notebook, edges soft with age, held shut by a rubber band that had been replaced so many times it was really the 4th rubber band standing in for the original. She never took it out in front of anyone. It looked, if you'd glimpsed it, like a woman's grocery list or a prayer book. It was neither. That would matter too, and it would matter more than anything else in this story, but not for another hour. The staff at Halvern liked her well enough, in the distracted, half-attentive way people like a person they've never actually gotten to know. Priya sometimes brought her a coffee she hadn't asked for and left it on the edge of the console nearest the door, a small kindness that had become routine enough that neither of them commented on it anymore. Dev, still new enough to the building to be friendly with everyone by default, occasionally asked her opinion on nothing important, whether it was supposed to rain, whether the vending machine on the 2nd floor was broken again, and she always answered pleasantly, briefly, in a way that closed the conversation gently rather than inviting more of it. Callum, in the 6 months since he'd taken over as shift supervisor, had exchanged maybe 40 words with her total, mostly logistics. Had she seen the missing supply key? Could she avoid the east stairwell on Thursday because of a contractor working there? None of it was unkind. It was simply the ordinary, unremarkable invisibility that comes with a uniform nobody looks twice at, in a building full of people trained to give their full attention to screens and radios and checklists, and none of it left over for the woman with the cart. She didn't mind it, most nights, or had trained herself convincingly enough to believe she didn't. There was something almost peaceful in being the person nobody watched closely, nobody asking her to justify a decision, nobody reviewing her performance, nobody waiting for her to make the one mistake that would end everything again. She had built, over 11 years, an entire quiet life around not being watched, and there were nights she was genuinely grateful for it. This particular Tuesday did not feel, in its first 90 minutes, any different from the hundreds that came before it. She emptied the bins in the break room. She wiped down the long table where the day shift left crumbs from a birthday cake nobody had bothered to fully clean up. She refilled the coffee station, checked the paper towel dispenser in the 2nd floor bathroom, and made her way, a little after 9:40, up to the radar room, where she began, as she always did, with the old repeater in the corner. To understand why a 52-year-old woman in a green polo shirt was the only person in that building capable of doing what she was about to do, you have to go back further than the notebook, further than the headphones, back to a version of Adeyeze Obi that almost nobody currently working at Halvern had ever met. 26 years old, freshly certified, standing at a radar console for the first time without a training supervisor breathing over her shoulder, That was the ideas that Captain Ibrahim Sese used to introduce, half joking, half serious, as the only controller I've trained who argues with the equipment instead of trusting it, which is either going to make her the best one I've ever produced or get her fired inside 2 years. Sese had run approach control at 3 different regional airports across 31 years, and he had a reputation, not entirely flattering, for training controllers who didn't just read a radar screen, they interrogated it. He used to say that radar didn't lie, but it also didn't always tell you the whole truth. And the difference between those two things was the only thing worth learning in 30 years on the job. He taught his trainees to notice not just what a target showed, but how it behaved. The tiny inconsistencies, the almost too smooth updates, the speed profiles that were mathematically possible but statistically wrong for the aircraft type squawking that code. Most of his trainees found it exhausting and eventually let the habit fade once they'd been certified a few years and trusted the modern systems the way everyone else did. Adayeze never let it fade. She kept doing it long after Sese retired and moved overseas, long after most of her peers had stopped thinking of radar as something you argued with rather than something you simply read. Sese's method, in the years he trained her, had almost nothing to do with the official curriculum. The official curriculum taught procedure, separation minimums, phraseology, the exact sequence of actions for 100 different scenarios, all of it necessary, none of it, in his view, sufficient. What he actually spent his evenings teaching her, unofficially, off the clock, in a back room with a decommissioned scope of its own, was pattern literacy. The idea that every radar target had a kind of handwriting, a set of tiny behavioral fingerprints, how quickly it updated, how its speed bled off in a turn, how its altitude readout jittered under different weather loads, and that a controller who learned to read that handwriting could tell, often before any alarm sounded, when something on the screen was behaving like an aircraft that wasn't quite behaving like an aircraft. He made her sit for hours watching old recorded traffic with the audio off, guessing which targets were real weather returns, which were birds, which were genuine aircraft, purely from the shape of their movement. And he corrected her, gently but relentlessly, for 2 full years before he ever told her she was getting good at it. Anyone can follow a checklist, he told her once, the night she finally passed his private test 3 times in a row without a miss. I'm not interested in training someone who follows checklists. I'm interested in training someone the checklist hasn't been written for yet, because the day it matters, it won't be on the list. She used to think that was Sese being dramatic, the way older mentors sometimes are, building myth around their own methods. It took her exactly 1 December night to understand he'd meant it literally. Under his training, she became known, quietly, inside the building, never in any public way, because it wasn't the kind of thing that made it onto a performance review, as the controller who could look at a radar return and know, before the computer flagged anything, when something about it didn't smell right. She'd caught 2 near-miss errors in her first 4 years that never made the news because she caught them before they became anything worth reporting. A stuck transponder that would have put 2 regional turboprops into the same altitude block over a ridgeline in weather, and a mislabeled target during a runway incursion drill that, in a live scenario, would have sent a fuel truck directly into a departing aircraft's path. Neither incident ever generated a headline. Both times, the fix happened quietly enough that most of the building never even heard about it, which was, in its own way, exactly the kind of invisible competence this story is built around, the sort of save that only gets noticed by its absence, not its presence. Sese used to keep a private tally of those saves in a notebook of his own, not because anyone asked him to, but because he said someone should, since the building's official records never would. He gave that notebook to her the week he retired, the year before the December incident, half joking that she'd need somewhere to keep writing once he wasn't there to do it for her. She still has it. It sits, these days, next to the newer one, the one with the 4th rubber band, on the same shelf at home, 2 records of the same kind of quiet, unrewarded attention, a decade apart. And then, on a foggy December night, 10 years and 2 months before this story begins, everything about that reputation got buried under a single report. A regional jet carrying 41 people had come within 400 feet of a cargo aircraft on approach, both aircraft legally where they were supposed to be according to their own instruments, both pilots reacting in the last several seconds to a visual, near miss neither controller had time to fully process before it was already resolving itself. The official investigation ran for 11 months. The final report attributed the near collision to controller error, radar misread, target confusion under fatigue conditions, Adaize Obi's error, according to the language on page 14, because she had been the controller working that specific sector when the phantom appeared. Her license was suspended immediately, pending review, and then quietly revoked after an appeals process that never once asked her the one question she had tried to raise from the very first interview. Why had the radar shown her a target on a converging course with the cargo aircraft? A target with a transponder code. A target every junior controller in the room that night could also see on their own screens, when every single recording pulled afterward, every flight data recorder, every radio transmission log, every piece of physical evidence anyone bothered to check, showed conclusively that no such aircraft had ever actually been airborne in that airspace at that time. Nobody believed her. Not the union, whose lawyer told her privately that radar doesn't invent aircraft, and juries don't believe stories that sound like science fiction. Not Sese, who was overseas by then, teaching a training program in another country, and didn't even see the full file until it was already closed and appealed and closed again. She lost her license, lost her career, lost the version of herself that had spent 4 years being quietly, invisibly excellent at the one thing she'd ever wanted to do, and eventually took the only job the airport authority would still quietly give her, because someone in facilities remembered she used to be good at her work and felt sorry enough for her to make a phone call, cleaning the building she used to run. She kept the notebook from that night, not as evidence, she'd tried evidence, and evidence hadn't been enough, but because writing down the exact shape of what she'd seen, the precise timing, the precise pattern of the target's impossible movement, was the only way she'd found to keep from doubting her own memory of it. 10 years is a long time to be the only person who believes something happened exactly the way you remember it happening. She never stopped believing the target had been real, in the sense that it had been put there, deliberately, by something or someone, even if she'd spent a decade unable to prove it or say it out loud to anyone who mattered. And even if some nights, lying awake, she genuinely wondered whether she'd simply broken under the pressure the way the report said she had, and imagined the whole thing, and ruined her own life over a mistake she couldn't even remember making correctly. In the years between, she had built an entire private discipline around not letting the anger show, because the one time she had let it show, during the appeal, in front of the review board, voice cracking as she tried to explain a pattern nobody in that room had the training to actually evaluate, it had been noted in the file as emotional instability under review, a phrase that followed her for the rest of the process and made everything after it easier for everyone to dismiss. She learned, slowly, painfully, to stop arguing out loud entirely, to keep the argument contained in a spiral notebook instead, where it couldn't be used against her, where it couldn't crack in front of anyone and get written down as evidence of exactly the kind of unreliability the report had already decided to find in her. It is worth sitting with, for a moment, what that actually costs a person. Spending a decade being right about something in total, unwitnessed silence. Because the one time she tried to be right about it out loud, it was used as proof that she couldn't be trusted at all. That was the woman standing in the corner of the radar room on a foggy Tuesday night in December, exactly 10 years and 2 months later, when Callum Reyes, 34, sharp, 6 months into the job as shift supervisor, and entirely unaware of any of this history because nobody had told him, because personnel files at Halvern didn't include the parts of a person's story that weren't legally required, looked at a phantom return blinking onto the main display and said, with total confidence, to the 2 junior controllers on shift with him, radar doesn't hallucinate aircraft. If it's on the scope, it's real, and if it disagrees with the flight plan's wrong, not the radar. It was a fair thing to say. Every certification he'd ever earned told him exactly that. The building's radar systems had been fully upgraded 4 years earlier, cost $11 million, and had a flawless operational record in every safety audit since. He had no reason on earth to doubt his own screen, and doubting it would have gone against everything his training had ever taught him to trust. Callum wasn't reckless and he wasn't arrogant. He was a competent man, doing exactly what competent men are trained to do, which was trust the tools built by people more qualified than himself to build them. The 2 junior controllers on shift that night, Priya Chandrasekaran and a 25-year-old named Dev Okonkwo, working his 11th solo overnight, Both looked at the same target and saw the same thing Callum saw. An unidentified aircraft, no transponder code beyond a garbled fragment that kept flickering between two nearly identical strings of digits, closing on a direct intercept course with Halvern 118. A regional jet inbound from the coast with 187 people on board, 11 minutes from touchdown in fog thick enough that visual separation was impossible, and every single decision in the next several minutes would have to be made on trust in what the radar said was true. Adaeze had picked up on it 4 minutes before Callum ever looked up from his coffee. She'd been standing at her cart near the old decommissioned repeater, the one she cleaned twice a night for reasons nobody understood, and she'd noticed, the way she used to notice 10 years ago, that the Phantom return's speed had increased by exactly 9 knots in 6 seconds. A jump no real aircraft under those atmospheric conditions could physically make without a structural failure that would have shown up on every other sensor in the sky. It wasn't flying, it was being drawn, the way a cursor is drawn across a screen by someone else's hand, smooth and deliberate in a way real turbulence and real pilots never quite managed to be. She didn't say anything right away. Saying something meant explaining who she used to be, and the last time she'd tried to explain who she used to be, it had cost her everything she had. She stood very still by her cart for almost 90 full seconds, doing the kind of math in her head that she hadn't let herself do out loud in a decade, watching the numbers refuse to add up into anything except the one explanation she least wanted to be true. Then she picked up her old headphones, the ones she wore around her neck every night and had never once used to block out noise, and for the first time in 10 years, she plugged them into the ancient repeater in the corner, the one still wired, still live, still quietly running on an isolated circuit that nobody had bothered to decommission, because decommissioning it properly cost more in engineering hours than simply leaving it dark and forgotten. The old system, built before the current network, before the current software, before whatever this thing was that had gotten into the building's main radar feed, showed something completely different. It showed no Phantom aircraft anywhere near Halvern 1118. It showed, instead, a real, unregistered, transponder-silent aircraft 9 miles further west than anyone thought to look, flying low, flying fast, on a heading that, if extended, would take it nowhere near the approach corridor everyone in the room was staring at. The Phantom on the main screen wasn't a malfunction. It was a decoy, and whatever was creating it was good enough, current network enough, that it had to be coming from somewhere inside a system Callum Reyes trusted completely. Which meant, whatever this was, it wasn't an equipment failure. It was being done to them, by someone who understood exactly how Halvern's radar worked, in real time, on purpose. She crossed the room and told him what the old repeater showed. He looked at her, a 52-year-old cleaning woman in a green polo shirt holding a pair of ancient headphones, standing next to a machine he'd been told during his onboarding tour was basically a museum piece, don't worry about it. And he did not laugh, because Callum Reyes wasn't a cruel man, but he also did not believe her, and given everything he knew about her, everything the personnel file said, which was simply, facilities staff, 11 years, no notable incidents, his doubt made perfect sense. I appreciate you, he told her, the way people tell someone they're about to ignore, gently and with genuine, misplaced kindness. But that machine's been off the network for over a decade. It's not even calibrated against current airspace data, current terrain models, current anything. I have $11 million of modern radar telling me something different, a full safety audit trail behind it, and 187 people whose lives depend on me trusting the system that's never once failed me in 6 years of operation. I can't make a call based on a decommissioned machine and a hunch. It was the most reasonable sentence anyone could have said in that room, delivered by a man who had every professional obligation to say exactly that, and it was almost catastrophically wrong. Now type FOG in the comments if you've ever had to trust your own read on a situation when every official system around you said you were wrong. Because in about 4 minutes, that's exactly the choice this story is about to force, and I promise you the ending recontextualizes everything you think you understand about who was really flying blind that night. 9 minutes remained until Halvern 118's scheduled touchdown. In the cockpit, though nobody in the radar room could hear it, the pilots of Halvern 118 were dealing with their own version of the same fog-blind uncertainty, trusting their instruments completely because thick cloud at that altitude left them no other choice. running their approach checklist with the calm, practiced rhythm of two people who had done this exact descent 1,000 times before and had no reason to expect tonight to be any different, which was, in its own way, exactly the quiet, invisible stakes the entire scene depended on. 187 people were currently trusting two systems they couldn't see, flown by two pilots trusting a third system they also couldn't fully verify from the cockpit, and none of them had any idea that the only thing standing between an ordinary landing and a very different kind of night was a decommissioned radar repeater and the woman who'd refused to stop listening to it. Priya, the more senior of the two junior controllers, tried to split the difference the way careful people often do in moments like this. She pulled up the secondary radar feed, a different vendor's system installed as backup 2 years earlier specifically to cross-check the primary, and found, to everyone's mounting unease, that it agreed with the primary. Two modern, properly calibrated, independently sourced systems, both showing the same phantom target on the same collision course. Against that, Adeze had one decommissioned machine last serviced during a presidency 2 elections ago, and a woman's word. This was the point where a weaker version of this story would have let Adeze simply be right and everyone else simply be wrong, and where the real version of that Tuesday night got more complicated than that. Because Adeze herself, standing there with two modern systems disagreeing with her one old one, felt the exact same cold doubt that had haunted her for 10 years. The specific, familiar terror of being the only person in a room who believes something the instruments disagree with, and remembering exactly how that story had ended for her the last time. For nearly 90 seconds, she said nothing else. She stood at that old repeater, doubting her own eyes, the way the entire aviation industry had spent a decade teaching her to. And it was, in its own quiet way, the most dangerous 90 seconds of the entire night. Because doubt has its own kind of gravity, and it very nearly kept her still long enough for the window to close. What broke the doubt wasn't confidence, it was the notebook. She pulled it out of her coat pocket, right there, in front of Callum, in front of Priya and Dev, the first time in 10 years anyone at that building had seen it, and opened it to a page she'd read so many times the ink had started to fade at the fold. She wrote down the phantom target's exact timestamp pattern from the old repeater, the interval between its impossible speed jumps, precise to the 10th of a second, and set it down directly beside a page from 10 years earlier, a page she had copied, in the same trembling handwriting, from the incident report she'd been given during her own appeal, back when she'd still had a lawyer and a case, and a reason to believe someone might eventually listen. The two patterns matched, not similar, not close. Identical down to the 10th of a second, the same signature repeating itself a decade apart. In the same building, under nearly identical weather conditions, at nearly the same time of night. That was the first twist, and it changed everything about what this crisis actually was. It wasn't a random glitch in new equipment, and it wasn't a case of one old, sentimental machine happening to disagree with two good ones by coincidence. It was the second appearance of something that had already destroyed one career and nearly ended 41 lives a decade earlier, executed by someone who understood Halvern's systems well enough to fake a convincing target not once but twice, a decade apart, and who had never once been caught, investigated, or even suspected, because the entire weight of the first investigation had landed on the one person in the building telling the truth. 7 minutes to touchdown. Callum stared at the 2 pages laid side by side, a decade of separation between 2 identical fingerprints, and to his credit, and this is the point in the story where his character actually earns the reversal that's coming, he didn't dismiss it out of pride. He asked the one question that mattered. Where did you get the second pattern? And she told him. The December incident, 10 years ago, her license, her name on page 14 of a report that had never once considered the possibility that the radar itself had been compromised, rather than the controller reading it. Callum went very quiet, the particular quiet of a man rapidly resorting everything he thought he knew about a building he'd been running for 6 months. Then he did something that took more courage than anyone in that room fully understood in the moment, because it meant undoing his own certainty in real time, in front of 2 junior controllers whose respect he'd need for years to come, with 6 minutes on the clock. He picked up the phone to Airspace Network Security and asked who currently had remote access privileges to Halvern's radar network, not because he'd fully accepted Adeze's theory yet, but because it was the fastest way to either confirm or eliminate it. And a good controller, whatever else he was, always ran the check that could be run in seconds rather than argue about the one that couldn't. The answer came back 30 seconds later, and it had a name attached. Ferris Klein, a contractor brought on 18 months ago to manage the very same $11 million radar upgrade that had made the old repeater obsolete in the first place. A man with legitimate, standing, unrestricted remote access to exactly the systems currently showing a false target, logged into the network from an external terminal at that exact moment. According to the access log, Priya pulled up with shaking hands. She recognized the name immediately, though not for any reason that seemed significant at the time. Klein had trained 2 of the newer technicians on the current system 8 months earlier, had sat in on a handful of routine meetings, had been, by every account she could recall, quiet, competent, and entirely unremarkable. The kind of contractor whose face you forget within a week of the job ending. It didn't match, in her head, with anything resembling a threat, and for a few seconds, she found herself doing exactly what Callum had done with Adeze 20 minutes earlier. Quietly discounting the possibility, because nothing about the man fit what she expected a saboteur to look like. A small, human instinct that had nearly cost the December investigation everything a decade earlier for the same reason, in reverse. And then, because Dev, the 25-year-old on his 11th solo overnight, the one person in the room with nothing invested in either believing or disbelieving Adeze, simply curious enough to keep pulling threads while the others argued about what to do next, cross-referenced old contractor onboarding files out of nervous habit more than any real expectation of finding something. He found something nobody expected to find, with 4 minutes left on the clock. Ferris Klein had also briefly worked at Halvern 10 years and 2 months ago as a junior systems technician, under a different last name, on a 6-month contract that ended, according to the file, the week after the December incident, with no explanation on record beyond contract concluded. Dev read the name out loud twice before anyone fully registered what he'd said, and when Adeze heard it, something in her face changed in a way neither Callum nor Priya had ever seen from her in 11 years of walking past her cart in the hallway. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, but the specific, quiet devastation of finally having a name to put to a decade of being told there was nothing there at all. 5 minutes to touchdown, and now the trust question wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a name, a second name, a paper trail a decade old, and a live connection to the building's network that nobody could immediately locate or sever without risking the crude, blunt option of cutting all radar power entirely. An option that would have been its own kind of catastrophe, with an aircraft 11 minutes from a fog-blind landing. For about 40 seconds, it looked like they'd lost the thread entirely. Priya, trying to trace Klein's remote session to a physical location, hit a wall. The connection was bouncing through a relay that returned nothing but a dead IP address, in a country with no extradition treaty, and no obligation to answer an airport's late-night query. And for those 40 seconds, the room had the specific, sinking feeling of a plan that had just run face-first into a locked door. Dev said quietly, almost to himself, "We're not going to find him in time." And for a moment, nobody in the room disagreed with him out loud. It felt, briefly, like the entire chase. The notebook, the timestamp match, the 10-year-old vindication finally within reach, had stalled out on the one obstacle nobody could brute force through, with 4 minutes left on the clock. Then Adeze, watching the old repeater instead of the network trace, said the thing that mattered more than finding Klein ever would have. "We don't need him. We need to know what he's aiming at, not where he's sitting." Chasing the operator was a dead end. Predicting the target wasn't. It was a small pivot, barely 10 seconds of dialogue. But it was the exact moment the room stopped trying to win the wrong fight and started, finally, fighting the one in front of them. 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Callum's instinct, reasonable and trained into him by every safety protocol Halvern had ever drilled into its staff, was to pull Halvern 118 into a holding pattern immediately and sort out the network breach on the ground, at leisure, with the aircraft safely circling above the fog, until someone could confirm what was real and what wasn't. It was the safe procedural answer, the one that would look defensible in any subsequent report, regardless of how the night ended. It was also, Adeze realized with a cold drop in her stomach, exactly the move that would give whoever was doing this more time to adjust the attack rather than less. Every extra minute in the sky was a minute the false target's controlling system had to refine its intercept solution against the real aircraft it was apparently trying to draw attention toward, an aircraft the main radar still couldn't see at all, and a minute Ferris Klein, wherever he was, could use to notice he'd been discovered and change his plan entirely. Waiting felt safer. Waiting was, in fact, the version of this crisis that ended badly, and Adesi had exactly 4 minutes to convince a man she'd known for less than half an hour that the safe-sounding choice was the dangerous one. This was the moral cost this story had been quietly building toward from the very beginning. There was no option left that came free. Diverting risked feeding the attacker more time and airspace to work with, and risked whatever the real, invisible aircraft 9 miles west was actually being used for. Landing immediately, on schedule, meant betting 187 lives on the 10-year-old, uncalibrated, decommissioned backup radar being right, and the $11 million modern system being wrong. Live, in real time, with no way to fully confirm either possibility before the window closed for good. Adesi had exactly one piece of leverage nobody else in the room possessed. 10 years of quietly, privately, obsessively rerunning that December night in her head, refusing to let it go long after everyone else had filed it away and moved on with their lives, which meant she was the only person alive who recognized this specific pattern the instant it reappeared, and the only person capable of predicting, with any real confidence, what it was actually going to do next. 4 minutes. She told Callum the real aircraft, the unregistered, transponder-silent one the old repeater had picked up 9 miles west, wasn't actually trying to collide with Halvern 1118 at all, and had probably never been intended to. It was using Halvern 118's approach path, and the panic a false collision warning would generate in the control room, as cover, riding in low and fast underneath the confusion the false target created while every eye in the building fixed itself on the wrong sky. Its actual heading, extended out on the old repeater's display, pointed not toward any runway but toward the airport's fuel storage depot at the western edge of the property, a soft target with almost no independent radar coverage of its own, protected mainly by the assumption that nothing would ever need to approach it from directly beneath a controlled commercial flight path during a live instrument approach, because no legitimate aircraft ever would. The phantom collision warning wasn't the attack, it was the smoke screen, and a very good one, built by someone who understood exactly how a control room's attention worked and exactly where to point it. That was the second twist, bigger than the first, and it meant every second spent worrying about a mid-air collision that was never actually going to happen was a second the real, silent aircraft used to close the distance to something far worse waiting on the ground. There was one more complication before the decision could actually be made, and it arrived in the form of the fire marshal's office, which had a standing rule requiring any confirmed airspace security threat within 5 miles of the airport perimeter to trigger a full facility lockdown, a rule written years earlier for an entirely different kind of scenario, and never once updated to account for something like this. If Callum formally declared what they were looking at as a security threat over the official channel, that lockdown would trigger automatically, sealing the depot's own security gates shut before ground personnel could physically reach the fence line, and pulling the exact team Adesi needed, racing toward the depot back into the main terminal instead, per protocol, to secure passengers first. Following the rule exactly, the way an 11-year record of 0 incidents told him to, would have handed the depot to whatever was inbound completely undefended. Breaking it meant declaring a plain, unofficial verbal alert instead, technically a procedural violation, the kind of thing that could cost a supervisor his own certification if the night went badly and someone later needed to explain why the formal protocol hadn't been followed. Callum broke it without hesitating, which surprised even Adesi, and radioed ground security directly rather than through the official system, buying the seconds that mattered and accepting, silently, that he'd just made a decision he might have to defend for the rest of his career, regardless of how the next 3 minutes went. 3 minutes. Callum made the call that would define the rest of his career in about 4 seconds of decision time. He cleared Halvern 118 to continue its approach exactly as planned, trusting the old repeater's read that the collision threat was fabricated, while simultaneously scrambling airport security toward the fuel depot, based on coordinates Adesi read off her handheld the way she used to, 10 years and 1 identity ago, when this had been her job and not someone else's memory of what her job used to be. Priya, to her lasting credit, backed the decision without hesitation once she saw the 2 timestamp patterns for herself, and it was Priya, not Callum, who got the words out over the radio to the depot's night security post in time for them to actually move. A small, unglamorous act of trust from someone with even less reason to extend it than Callum had, since she'd known Adeze even less time than he had, and it mattered enormously in a story built almost entirely on the question of who deserved to be believed and when. 2 minutes. The unregistered aircraft, still invisible to the main radar, still perfectly visible on the old repeater Adeze refused to stop watching even for a second, banked hard west exactly as she'd predicted, breaking away from Halvern 118's flight path entirely and dropping altitude toward the depot fence line. Proof, immediate and undeniable, playing out in real time on a decommissioned screen nobody in that building had trusted for 11 years, that she had read the situation correctly from the very first 90 seconds. Back when she'd still been standing alone by her cart, doubting herself. 1 minute. Ground security reached the depot perimeter 30 seconds ahead of the aircraft. Enough time to trigger a floodlight array along the fence line. Not a weapon. Nothing capable of physically stopping an aircraft. Just enough sudden, blinding light at low altitude in thick fog to force whoever or whatever was piloting that low-flying, remote-guided intruder to abort the run, rather than risk a blind final approach into unknown terrain they could no longer see clearly. It pulled up hard, climbed away north, and vanished from even the old repeater's range within 11 seconds. Its exact fate unknown. Its operator never identified that night or in the weeks that followed. Ferris Klein's remote terminal connection dropped from the network at almost the same moment, and by the time anyone traced the login, it had been routed through enough overseas relays to lead nowhere conclusive, which meant, and this mattered more than anyone in that building wanted to admit out loud afterward, that whoever had done this once a decade ago, and once again tonight, had gotten away clean both times, and might still be out there right now deciding whether there would be a third night, at Halvern or somewhere else entirely. Halvern 118 landed 9 minutes later, on schedule, in fog, with 187 passengers who never knew, that night or any night since, how close the story had actually come to going a different way, or how much of what kept them safe had depended on a machine nobody trusted and a woman nobody had bothered to ask a single question about in 11 years. The control room didn't erupt into celebration the way it might have in a different kind of story. It went, instead, into the particular hush that follows genuine danger rather than the performed danger of a drill. The kind of quiet where everyone's hands are a little too busy with paperwork nobody actually needs yet, because moving your hands is easier than sitting still with what almost happened. Dev sat down hard in his chair and didn't get up for several minutes. Priya kept rechecking the depot security feed long after the aircraft was gone, watching an empty fence line lit up white against the fog, as if making sure the danger had actually left and wasn't simply waiting somewhere just outside the frame. Nobody said much. Callum was already on the phone with Airspace Network Security, then with the airport authority's overnight duty manager, then, eventually, with a federal aviation investigator who would arrive by helicopter before sunrise and spend the next 6 hours interviewing everyone in the building except, at first, Adeze, because her name still didn't appear on any current staff roster with a title that made her presence in that room during a live incident make procedural sense. It took Callum physically walking the investigator over to her, printout in hand, to get that fixed before the interviews even started. It cost Adeze something to be right. Not her job. Callum saw to that within the week, quietly pushing through a full reinstatement review with her original 10-year-old file attached. This time with the December incident's actual radar signature evidence included for the first time in a decade. Evidence that finally, formally, forced the airport authority to reopen a case they had every institutional incentive to leave closed. What it cost her was quieter than that, and harder to put in any report. Standing at that old repeater for 11 straight minutes, replaying the worst night of her professional life, in real time, while 187 strangers' lives hung on whether she'd finally, after a decade, been believed by someone with the authority to act on it, she felt something in her chest that her doctor would later, gently, describe as a stress response serious enough to warrant real attention. The physical toll of 10 years spent unable to let go of a night nobody else remembered, finally cashing out all at once under fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning, her hands shaking so badly afterward, that she couldn't hold her own pen to sign the incident statement Callum asked her to write. She didn't tell him the full extent of it. She just sat down on an upturned bucket in the corner of the room she used to run and let her hands shake until, eventually, slowly, they stopped. Callum found her there 20 minutes later, after the depot security team had cleared the scene and the building had settled back into something resembling its normal overnight quiet. He didn't make a speech. He picked up the old repeater's printout, the one showing both timestamp patterns side by side across a decade, and turned it over in his hands like he was trying to memorize the shape of how wrong he'd almost been. "I've spent 6 months trusting the machines in this building over the people in it," he said, finally. "Because that's what I was trained to do, and because it's easier, and because it's never once been wrong before tonight. Tonight the machine was the thing lying to me, and the person mopping the floor was the only one who knew the difference, and I don't have a way to make an apology that's big enough for that. So I'm just going to start by asking you to teach me what you were actually listening for, because I clearly don't know how to listen for it myself." Then he asked her the one question nobody had asked in 10 years. What was in the notebook, really? And why had she kept it this long? And why had she never once, in 11 years of cleaning this building twice a week, tried to tell anyone what she thought she'd seen? She told him. Not the whole story. Some of it she still couldn't say out loud, even that night, even to a man who had just risked his career on her word. But enough. Enough to explain the 90 seconds of doubt by the cart, the fear of being disbelieved again, the specific, particular loneliness of spending a decade certain of something the entire aviation industry had officially decided wasn't true. She told him about the review board and the phrase emotional instability under review, and the way she'd taught herself afterward to never again let anyone see her be certain of anything out loud. Callum listened without interrupting, which she would tell him later was rarer and harder than he probably realized, because most people who ask a question like that one aren't actually prepared for the whole answer, and he sat there and took it anyway, past the point where a more careful supervisor might have steered the conversation back toward paperwork and shift logs and the comfortable, procedural business of closing out an incident report. And that was when the final twist landed. The one that had been sitting in plain sight from the very first scene without anyone, including you, having any real reason to suspect it yet. The reason she cleaned that old decommissioned repeater twice a night, every single shift, for 6 years, humming the same 4 bars under her breath while she did it, wasn't habit and wasn't simple pride in her work at all, the way it had looked to every single person who'd ever glanced at her doing it and assumed nothing of it. It was the exact same thing a private, unauthorized ritual would be for anyone who'd been forced out of the one thing they were ever truly excellent at. A quiet, unsanctioned check she'd been running on that machine's live feed for 6 years running. Ever since the day the airport authority handed her a mop instead of a controller's headset, because some stubborn, unwilling to fully let go part of her had never actually stopped believing the December incident could happen again, and had spent 6 years, twice a week, making sure that if it did, there would be one machine in that building still capable of telling the truth, and one person still watching it closely enough, faithfully enough, humiliatingly enough, for anyone who'd once had a real career to notice. She hadn't caught tonight's ghost by luck, and she hadn't caught it because some rare, one-time flash of old expertise happened to resurface at exactly the right moment out of narrative convenience. She'd caught it because for 6 years, twice a week, nobody watching, nobody asking why, she had refused to stop being a controller, even after the entire system that trained her, employed her, and then discarded her had told her, formally and in writing, that she wasn't allowed to be one anymore. The notebook wasn't evidence she'd been keeping in case anyone ever asked. It was proof she'd been keeping for herself, on the nights she doubted her own memory the most, that she hadn't imagined any of it. In the weeks immediately after, the story stayed out of the news entirely, by design. The airport authority had no interest in publicizing a security breach involving a spoofed radar target and an unidentified drone near a fuel depot, and the federal investigation preferred to work quietly, rather than tip off whoever was behind it, that the pattern had finally been noticed. Which meant that, for a long stretch of that winter, the only people who knew what had actually happened that Tuesday night were the 4 people who'd been in the room for it, plus a rotating handful of investigators who came and went without much explanation. Adiaze found this, unexpectedly, easier than she'd imagined it would be. She had spent 10 years being disbelieved loudly, publicly, in a way that followed her into every job interview and every quiet conversation with a former colleague who no longer quite met her eyes. Being believed quietly, privately, by exactly the 4 people who actually mattered, turned out to be worth more to her than any public vindication could have been. Callum offered, more than once, to push for some kind of formal recognition, a commendation, a mention in the airport authorities' newsletter, something. She turned it down every time. She didn't need the building to know. She needed the building to trust her, and it already did. The following spring, an internal review, quietly conducted, more thoroughly than the first one had ever been, this time with Sese flown back in specifically to consult, gray-haired now, and furious in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be a decade earlier, when he'd been half a world away, and hadn't fought hard enough for his own student, formally reversed the finding from 10 years earlier. The December incident was reclassified, at last, as an external interference event rather than controller error. Adese's license was reinstated in full. She was offered her old position back, senior approach controller, the same console, more or less, that she'd been forced away from a decade earlier, and Callum personally cleared out a space for her use, printed a name placard for the console, before she'd even formally accepted, because he wanted her to see it there before she said yes, not after. She took the job. Of course she took the job. But the 6 months between that foggy December night and the day she sat back down at a live console for the first time in a decade were not, in any sense, an easy stretch. And the story would be lying to you by omission if it skipped past them entirely. Reinstatement meant recertification, and recertification meant sitting for the same exams she'd passed at 26, now at 52. In a training environment that had changed in 100 small ways she had to relearn from scratch. New phraseology conventions, new automated conflict alert software, new aircraft types with performance envelopes she'd never worked before. She failed one of the simulator evaluations on her first attempt, badly enough that the assessor recommended a second round of remedial training before anyone would sign off on putting her back in a live sector. And she sat in her car in the parking lot afterward for 40 minutes before she could make herself drive home, certain, for the length of one very bad evening, that the last decade had broken something in her that couldn't actually be fixed, just because a report had finally been reclassified. Sese called her that night. Callum had tracked him down and given him her number without asking first, which she forgave him for eventually, and told her, in the same flat, unimpressed tone he'd used on her 26 years earlier, that failing a simulator once at 52 after a 10-year gap wasn't a referendum on her competence. It was simply what recertification looked like for anyone, and that she should stop treating one bad evaluation like a second verdict on her entire career. She passed the second attempt 3 weeks later. Callum, for his part, spent those same 6 months quietly rebuilding the case file the original investigation should have built the first time, cross-referencing the December incident's radar logs against the new incidents, pulling network access records going back a decade, chasing down 2 other regional airports that, it turned out, had experienced unexplained radar anomalies in the years between, anomalies that had been written off, in both cases, as equipment glitches and never connected to Halvern at all, because nobody had ever thought to look for a pattern spanning 3 different facilities and 10 years. He built a timeline nobody had ever assembled before, and when he finally handed it to the federal investigator, it was thick enough that the reclassification of the December incident stopped being a debate and became, essentially, a formality. She was offered her old position back, senior approach controller, the same console, more or less, that she'd been forced away from a decade earlier, and Callum personally cleared out a space for her use, printed a name placard for the console before she'd even formally accepted, because he wanted her to see it there before she said yes, not after. She asked for one condition nobody expected and nobody at first understood, until she explained it. She wanted the old decommissioned repeater kept exactly where it was, fully reconnected to the network now. Yes, cross-checked against the modern systems every single shift the way it should have been all along, but physically left in that same corner, at that same angle, close enough to the same spot she'd stood in for 6 years with a mop bucket instead of a headset. Not for sentiment, she told Callum, though it was partly that too, but because the entire reason that December night had finally been made right was that one machine had been kept alive, off to the side, unglamorous, unfunded, unnoticed, quietly telling the truth to anyone patient enough to keep listening to it, and she never wanted anyone at Halvern to forget, the way the rest of the industry so easily had, how much can end up depending on the thing everyone else assumed was obsolete. She still cleans that repeater's housing herself sometimes, even now, even with her headset back on and her name back on the console placard, even with a staff of 2 junior controllers of her own to train the way Sese once trained her. She doesn't need to anymore. It's back on the main network, cross-checked every shift, maintained on an actual budget line for the first time in over a decade. But some nights, in the quiet hour before dawn, she still runs a cloth along those same 6 dials, in the same order, humming the same 4 bars, not because the building needs her to, but because for 6 years that small, private, unwitnessed ritual was the only part of her old life nobody could take away from her. And some habits you keep even after they've stopped being a secret, even after the whole world finally, belatedly, catches up to what you already knew was true. Dev asked her once, months later, on a slow overnight shift with nothing much moving on either screen, what song it actually was. The 4 bars she hummed, the ones nobody in 11 years had ever thought to ask about. She told him it wasn't a song at all. It was the 4-note chime the old system used to play on startup, back when it was new, back before anyone at Halvern had a reason to think of it as obsolete, and she'd simply gotten into the habit, 26 years old and freshly certified, of humming it to herself every time she sat down at a live console, the way some people knock twice on wood or touch a doorframe on their way out of a room. It wasn't superstition, not really. It was just a sound that meant, to her, pay attention now. And somewhere over the last 3 decades, without ever quite deciding to, she had made sure it was the last thing she thought, every single time, before she started listening for something everyone else assumed wasn't there. Ferris Klein was never found. The network trail he left behind pointed, eventually, toward a private contracting firm with no fixed address and a client list nobody at the airport authority was ever cleared to see. And the file, as far as anyone at Halvern knows, remains open, unresolved, sitting in the same category of unfinished business the December incident occupied for 10 quiet years before somebody finally refused to let it stay that way. The federal investigator who worked the case for 6 months told Callum, off the record, near the end of the investigation, that whoever built the false target had clearly done this kind of thing before. The sophistication of the spoofing signature wasn't something a person builds and only uses twice in a decade for no reason. Which meant Halvern likely wasn't the only facility that had ever been tested this way, only the one where somebody finally happened to be paying close enough attention to notice both times it happened. Adeze doesn't talk about that part often. Some nights, driving home in the hour before dawn, the way she used to when the only thing waiting for her at the console was a mop and a cart, she still finds herself running the old December timestamps against nothing in particular, out of habit more than fear, the way you check a lock on a door you're fairly sure you already locked. She keeps the notebook. She's added pages to it since that night. New patterns, cross-referenced against nothing yet. Because so far as anyone knows, nothing has happened again. Not at Halvern, not at the 2 other regional airports Callum's timeline eventually connected to the same signature. But she checks the old repeater every single shift regardless, the way she has for years, the way she probably always will, because she is, more than anything else this story is really about, a woman who learned the hard way, at enormous personal cost, that the only real defense against being ignored is refusing, quietly, patiently, for as long as it takes, to stop paying attention. Sese came to visit the following autumn, officially retired now for the 2nd time, older, slower, leaning on a cane he complained about constantly and refused to actually use properly. He sat in the observation gallery above the radar room for the better part of an evening shift, watching his former student run a live sector with the same unhurried, watchful stillness he remembered from 26 years earlier. And when she finally came up to see him during a break, he didn't say anything about the December incident, or the decade she'd lost, or the reinstatement, or any of it. He just nodded at the old repeater, visible through the glass, still sitting in its corner, cross-checked and humming quietly alongside the modern systems now, instead of gathering dust beside them, and said, "Good, you kept it." As if that had always been the only thing that ever really mattered. Not the 10 years, not the vindication, not even the 187 people who never knew her name. Just the fact that somebody had kept listening, the whole time, to a machine everyone else had stopped believing in. This is the part of the story where I'd normally tell you the credits are rolling, but stay one more moment, because the ending is worth sitting with fully before you go. If you caught it, if somewhere around the headphones she never used for noise, or the notebook with the rubber band, or the 4 bars of a song nobody ever asked about, you had a feeling this story was going to circle back exactly the way it did, type ghost one more time in the comments. Right now, and tell me exactly where you caught it, because I read every single one of those, and I genuinely want to know whether the story played fair with you from the very first scene all the way back to a mop bucket set down without a sound, or whether I got you completely. And if you want to see what happens the next time someone underestimates the person in the room nobody's paying attention to, subscribe, because there's always another ghost on somebody's radar, and most of the time, nobody's watching for it closely enough, patiently enough, or long enough, the way they should be.